Hey there, fellow Tolkienites, fellow Tolk folk. So, it is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count. That is a quote from Tolkien in On Fairy Stories. I love that quote because it shows us that the details are what matters in Tolkien's mind when it comes to telling a good fantasy story, a good fairy story, a tale of the perilous realm. That essay on fairy stories, for those of you who don't know, he wrote it essentially around the time that The Hobbit was becoming very popular in the late 1930s, just as he was beginning to conceive of the Lord of the Rings, this which at the time would become the new Hobbit and eventually would become the Lord of the Rings and take on kind of a whole life of its own. Um, these were the things that were on his mind as he was telling these stories. So I thought it would be good to kind of use that to think about this question of adapting the Second Age to the TV, right? To the TV screen. What would Tolkien think about something like compressing the timeline of the Second Age, as the producers of the show have said will be done? Well, I think that quote right there tells us that he wouldn't have been a fan of that. In fact, there's another quote that I don't have right in front of me, but it's from one of his letters, and it's a letter in which I plan to deal in another video, with which I plan to deal in another video. And in that letter, he talks about how he's open to adaptations, right? He's open to people adapting his work for, at the time for movies, right? And in particular, animation, which I thought was really interesting. He liked the idea of animation as a vehicle for adapting his stories, and that's with regard to the Lord of the Rings, by the way. So he was open to the idea, and even said, "Hey, you know what? You don't have to tell it detail for detail in the sense of like you can abridge things, right? You don't have to necessarily include, for example, now he doesn't say this, but let's just give this an example. You don't have to include Tom Bombadil in a screen adaptation of Lord of the Rings." And this is coming from somebody who loves Tom Bombadil and would love to see Tom Bombadil adapted onto the screen in some way. Tolkien, I think, would have been fine with just completely leaving Tom Bombadil out of the film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. But what he says is that he's not okay with changing details, right? He's not okay with saying, like, well, instead of, Tom Bombadil being this guy that lives in the forest, maybe we'll combine Tom Bombadil and Elrond and make them kind of one character. And so Elrond kind of like, jumps around and is all like, Tom Bombadil-ish, right? And, he lives in Rivendell, which is in the old forest, right? Like combining these details so you kind of have two different things, right? Tolkien was like, "Nuh-uh, you don't do that, but you can abridge things, but you don't do that." And we see that again, like in this quote, right, on Fairy Stories, precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, right? It's all of those things that matter. He was rejecting this sort of idea that all stories are kind of really the same thing, and like it's just important that you kind of stick with the patterns and the kind of the big overarching themes and patterns, and then you can fit in like your own details as you see fit. And that's why so many of us Tolkien fans are so insistent on getting the details right. That's why we're so insistent. Questions. Look. And I've said myself that I'm actually, in theory, I'm okay with there being like black elves um, or a more warrior like Galadriel in the Second Age, and people are free to disagree with that. All right, on one side or the other. Okay, but I'm okay with those things depending on how you fit them in. Right. Now, we can have a debate about all those kinds of things, but if your rationale for doing those things is because, well, diversity, equity, and inclusion, no, that's ideological imposition, right? That dog don't hunt, okay? That's saying, okay, Tolkien's story doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the story was that he was trying to tell. What matters is the ideas that we put into the story and that we put on top of it. Okay, so that being your reason for doing these things, and then kind of forcing it upon Middle Earth, you can't do that. That's wrong. That violates what makes the Lord of the Rings, what makes the Legendarium the beautiful and wonderful thing that we love in the first place, right? That violates the creator's intent of it. Okay. Now you can have those. I'm okay with a more warrior adventurer like Galadriel, because Tolkien actually said that's what she was more like early on in her life. Okay. Now again, I know there are those of you who say, well, nah, right? We can have that debate. Okay. And this is not the video in which I'm going to do it. And there's we can get into all the nuances of that. And the same goes with the question of elves with darker skin tones, right? Could that have happened? There's a lot of nuance that goes into that debate. But right now, my working assumption is that, yes, it's possible within what I understand of the Legendarium of Middle Earth, right? And that's really the thing that I care about. It's what Tolkien himself thought. It's what Tolkien himself said, okay? Because I love this thing, I don't want to violate his intent. Interestingly enough, in that letter that I referenced, he also talked about wanting to have veto power over, over certain creative decisions. So I think he understood that, sometimes people who adapt these works, especially Hollywood types where there's a lot of money involved, there can be a tendency to want to cut corners, right? There can be a tendency to want to do things because, well, this will sell better for us, right? Like it's like this, just cheesy, like Hollywood executive kind of mentality of like, well, can't we have some more cute hobbits in there? That'll make it a lot more palatable for all the people out there. We'll sell lots of these ateliers, right? Like just that, like that caricature of the Hollywood executive, right? Like trying to make it, not understanding a thing about what makes the story great and only caring about the bottom line. Like, how much money can we make off of this? I think that's what's most scary maybe about the whole Amazon thing, is just how much money is involved in this. And that just means that executives are bound to get hold of it and be like, well, we got to change this. There's just too much risk with not doing that. That is one of the most scary things. But anyway, I digress on that point. I want to come back to the timeline. All right, so the timeline. You can't violate what Tolkien has laid down as the official timeline of the Second Age. Now, we don't know a lot about what they intend to do there. They've said, I think they used the term, I think their exact words were compressing the timeline. Don't quote me on that. But that was definitely the impression I came away from when I read their exact words, is we're going to hey, we just can't tell the story exactly how Tolkien laid it out. And it's like, well, then pick another story or find a way. It's as simple as that. Okay? Like, if you understand Tolkien, if you care anything about what Tolkien thought, that's what he would have said, right? Then pick another story. If you can't tell it, then pick another. He probably would have helped them, right? If he was still alive today, he probably would have helped them be like, okay, yeah, we can do it that way, right? He probably would have said like, how about you do it this way? I've proposed some ways in which they could have done it, right? You can do it via flashbacks. All right. You can tell the contemporary story via, lots of shows do this, right? I think of Lost, right? When it was on the air, and they would, remember when they'd have those episodes that they worked in where, it was kind of like you had the normal story arcs, and then they do an episode where you're like, you don't recognize any of the characters. Like, you're just like, what is this? And it turns out they're telling like this story that took place, one episode was devoted to like a story that took place, years before, right? And involved none of the current characters. But once you were done, you're like, oh, I understand how this all fits in, right? I could probably think of other shows that do this as well, because I watch a lot of these TV shows and I see how they do it. And I love those kinds of episodes. I love that kind of going back and finding out the backstory on certain things. There's I'm watching this show right now and I haven't finished it, but there's this, show called Under the Banner of Heaven that I'm watching right now based on this John Krakauer book that I read years ago. Greta and I are watching this right now, and it does a lot of that. It does a lot of like flashing back between different time periods, right? And so far, I think it's doing a pretty good job of it, right? Just like kind of unpacking different eras. So you can do that. That's one method. It's the flashback method, okay? The other method is devoting a season to different periods of this 3,000 year history, okay? So, and one thing people push back on is they say, well, then you'd have the men characters dying off. Well, guess what? That's what they did, right? Like that's what they did in the Second Age. You had Elros early on, right, as the first king of Numenor. Okay, and he actually lived for a very long time for a man. All right, and guess what? Elros was not a contemporary of Our Father's Own. All right, and he wasn't a contemporary with many of the other kings of Numenor and many of the other characters of that age. He was not a contemporary of Isildur, right? These characters do die off, but you know who doesn't die off? Elves. You know why? Because they're immortal, right? That's part of the universe. You can have Galadriel. You can have Elrond, who is the brother of Elros, right? You can have, um, you can have other Círdan, right? You can have Gil-galad, right? You can have all of these elvish characters who exist all throughout this period, and you can even show them in their character progression, and they become the main characters of this story, right? Of this story of the Second Age. You'd have Sauron too, right? You would have Sauron because he still existed, and they become the ones who unify the whole story, right? And then you have men who exist in different ages of the story. I bet, by the time we get later on into the show anyway, you're probably going to get to the later part of the story pretty quickly. And because there's a lot more that happens in the last part of the Second Age. So you're probably going to get to that a lot more quickly, after a couple of seasons. And then you're going to really have some men characters who are actually going to carry over into multiple seasons that way. But, it wouldn't be that hard. It wouldn't be that hard, okay? In fact, there was a really great comment on one of my recent videos here. Let's see here. This was on Orcish ideologies and the Rings of Power, and this is from a commenter named Dan B. So, Dan, thank you for this comment. I'm going to crediting Dan with this comment, but I really loved. I'm going to try to let me see if I can bump this one, and I don't know if I can highlight it or what, but anyway. I'm going to read the part of his comment that pertains to how he mapped out doing the whole 3,000-year arc, because I really liked this. This isn't the only way you could do it, but this is one way that he proposes of doing it. So, season 1, establishing of the realms. Elros, Elrond, Galadriel, Gil-galad, etc. establish the kingdoms. Maybe the Elrond and Galadriel take part in clearing off some remnants of Sauron's army, maybe even a fallen Maiar, but much weaker than Sauron, right? So yeah, you can work things like that into the legend, into the story without violating the legendarium, without violating what Tolkien himself set down as the canon, right? Season 2, jump forward. Season 2, the elves begin weary about the world changing, and in Numenor, Aldarion starts visiting. Meanwhile, kingdoms in the east and eastern dwarves start talking about a new dark lord. So we jump forward to 700, 800, I believe, is that time frame, and then you have Aldarion, right? The first great kind of mariner, right? Mariner king of Numenor, right? He starts journeying back to Middle Earth regularly and starts establishing these outposts of Numenor on the coast of Middle Earth. He also says of season 2, here I would have Glorfindel return. At the same time, Anator turns up with the same story as Glorfindel. Glorfindel helps with Lindon, Anatar with Holland. Reveal at the end of the season, after the rings are forged, that it is Sauron. Season 3, War of Elves and Sauron. Numenorians come to the rescue, but Sauron has the 7 and the 9, right? So we get the Rings of Power forged really in kind of that season 2, season 3 time frame, and we have the war, that first big war of the elves and Sauron going on then. And this is still, roughly early thousands, right, of the Second Age. So still a lot of history to go in the Second Age. Season 4, continued moral decline of Numenorians, Sauron handing out the rings, and we see the backstory of the Nazgul, some conflict with Numenorians colonizing and maybe good kings, and Harad taking the rings to save their people. I mean, there's so much you could do, right? This is just Dan, Dan commenting on one of my videos and giving ideas, right? This is not. This would be great. This would be, and this is what I thought they were gonna do, Season 5, Our Father's Own defeats Sauron, right? Boom. Okay. Season 6, moral collapse of Numenor ends with the fall of Numenor, and then Season 7 is the last alliance. Okay. I mean, that would have been awesome. I would love this. Okay? And I promise you, I don't see how it's possible that everybody wouldn't love that. All right? But the attitude was, we're going to do it our own way. I mean, we know better, right? It's just so disappointing. So, anyway, and not to dwell on the disappointment, folks, but I read that what Dan says, and I'm just like, yeah, that okay. But Amazon decided they were going to do it their own way with all of their $500 million wisdom. So it's just extremely disappointing. Um, Again, Tolkien himself, it is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count. All of the details count. Don't violate the details. If you need to abridge it, that's fine. And what Dan just laid out there, I mean, that's essentially an abridgment. You probably wouldn't work in every detail. You wouldn't tell the whole story of the mariner's wife, okay? In that, you probably have some of it with season 2, I think it was, right? You might have Arendis appear in there, but you probably wouldn't tell the whole story, okay? You wouldn't talk about everything we know about Galadriel, probably, right? But man, that would be a great show right there, and it would respect what Tolkien had laid out. So anyway, just some thoughts I wanted to share, on why I keep insisting on this, why I keep coming back to it. It just matters. I come back. I can't get away from this idea that we gotta respect, when it comes to Middle Earth, we gotta respect what Tolkien did, right? That's just a fundamental thing. We've got to respect how he viewed these things, how he laid out the universe, because he gave us this thing we all love. It was purely a work of his hands, right? This wasn't some work by committee. This wasn't some intellectual property where a bunch of people worked on it together, okay? This is the story that he told. And for people to get a hold of that with a lot of money and just have this attitude of like, well, we can do with it what we want because we own it, that's Sauronic, right? That's Sauronic. See my last video about the long defeat. Anyway, well, hopefully that doesn't put you in, in too negative a mood. I am legitimately, I will continue to say this, I'm legitimately looking forward to watching this show and talking about it, seeing what they do get right. I hope they get more right than they do wrong. I'm just ever since I heard about this, just my honest reaction, guys, I went from like really excited about this, like at the beginning of the year. And when I heard that they were going to compress the timeline, I was like, I just haven't been nearly as excited about it. I've just been like, I've been honestly a little depressed about it, I think, right? Not like in the grand scheme of things, right? But just depressed about, man, I thought this was going to be so much cooler. I just thought it was going to be so much cooler, where we're going to see the fullness of Tolkien's vision brought to life on the screen. And I just don't see it happening. So, well, if you want more encouraging and happy thoughts like that from me, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Hey, let's continue to talk about it in the comments below, everybody. I do appreciate all the comments, all the people who disagree with me, all the people who agree with me talking about it. Just keep it civil. No ad hominems, anything like that. You will get blocked if you start dealing in ad hominems, if you start asking snarky questions that really don't have anything to do with it. But if you want to come here and have a good faith conversation about all these things, we can feel free to disagree and agree about all of it, right? Just got to keep it civil, got to keep it respectful, and and let's make it all in good faith with each other. All right, everybody. So please hit that subscribe button. Please hit that like button. Please leave a comment, and I will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.